right, welcome. This is the August 14th, is that correct? August 14th meeting of the Issaquah Environmental Board. I'm Don McWilliams, and I'll be chairing tonight's meeting. Due to the hybrid format of today's meeting, I'd like to start by providing some guidelines. We have participants in the room as well as those attending virtually. For all meeting attendees, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. For those in the room, please raise your name card to indicate an interest to speak. For those attending virtually, mute your microphone when not speaking, and we'll call on you when you're ready to speak. If you're having technical issues, try joining the meeting using a different device, smartphone or tablet, or use the call-in information in the meeting invite to call in. Board members attending virtually, please to indicate your desire to speak, send a chat and type question or comment, or you can raise your hand virtually and we're watching for it, and wait to be acknowledged. We will summarize agreement around recommendations at the end of each talk and note if there's dissent. Stacy, can we go through attendance?
Tom Anderson.
Here.
Nina Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Finch.
Here.
Raj Gapandi.
Here.
Karen Pond.
Here.
Nina June has an excused absence. Don McWilliams.
Here.
Dixie Bear has an excused absence. Alex Lee Tigner has an excused absence. And Newcomb has an excused absence. Gonzalez.
Here.
And John Smith.
Here.
And Keith and John will be sitting in as regular members tonight. And
I understand we have somebody that would like to speak online.
Connie, you can unmute and go ahead and make your comments. Or sorry, do you have more?
No, that's fine.
Room public comment? Okay.
No, that's heard it before.
Yeah. Go ahead, Connie.
Okay. Yes, no, yes, no. Yes, I am making public comment, and because I grind through all of these reports in great detail, I went up level and I sent you all the city vision, which I don't know that you've actually seen the city vision much. And what struck me at the end of that vision was passion for the environment. And as I read through the urban forest management plan, and then yet again cruising through the comprehensive plan, you know, I actually didn't feel passion for the environment. There seems to be instead a management of the environment. There's no like vision and value statement at the beginning of the comprehensive plan that describes Issaquah and what it envisions itself to be. And so it turns into a plan that just says, and we have plans that support our plans that support our plans, but it doesn't say who the town or what the town is supposed to be for us who live here. And that's a big deficit. I think that it is, these are simply pieces of paper with no soul. Now, what I find encouraging is that the environmental board has shown this passion for the environment in unrelentingly making comments and trying to attempt changes and infuse all of these things with the spirit of the vision. And I don't want you to be discouraged because it does not feel like you're being supported often. This is a core value of the community, and we appreciate your efforts to imbue all of our plans with a passion for the environment and insist that that be included in all of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. All right, first up on our agenda tonight, Dan Hintz, the Urban Forest Supervisor, is here to talk to us about the draft Urban Forest Management Plan. Dan, you do the minutes first. Oh, missed that. Thank you. On the minutes from the last meeting, are there any comments, questions, clarifications that need to be added? Hearing none, the minutes are accepted. Okay. That's okay. All right, so Dan's here to talk to us about the Urban Forest Management Plan. Dan is joined by Chris Pfeiffer, is that correct? His consultant. And Dan is looking for some discussion around the plan at the end.
Great, thanks, Don. Yes, once again, I think I've met most of you, but Dan Hintz, the city's urban forest supervisor within our Parks and Community Services Department. I'll be handing it off to Chris here in just a minute to kind of take lead on the presentation, and then we'll both be here for questions, discussion as it relates to the first draft of the city's first urban forest management plan. And just kind of, this was in the memo I sent, but just a few reminders, this plan is really meant to serve as a roadmap and guiding document for the next decade as we continue to build our first urban forestry program. We've been in development of this since last fall. We brought this to the Environmental Board in November, which is really kind of early on. Again, in February to discuss some of the community engagement steps we were planning at the time, and then some of the internal staff and kind of internal plans and city policy review that Planet Geo did. And then we have since, developed the vision statement, 5 guiding principles, and then goals, strategies, and recommendations associated with each of those principles. So I know it's a big document shared out. I tried to kind of call out those sections with the guiding principles and those goals, strategies, and recommendations, which is section 2 of the draft report right now is an area to focus because we really want to make sure we feel good about what we have in there, or if we're missing anything, or if there's stuff we need to emphasize or change a little bit before then the last section that has not been built out is the implementation section. So really making sure we're feeling good about the strategies and recommendations before that gets incorporated in the second draft of the forest management plan. So that being said, we have a presentation that will recap a little bit of the kind of steps and process to date, and then really kind of focus in some of the kind of key sections. And as I mentioned, those goal strategies and recommendations, including the ICAP 55% goal and some of the scenarios to potentially achieve that as well. So want to reiterate too, we're bringing this to you tonight. We're really excited to have conversation, answers questions. If we don't get to comments or you have other feedback, I believe Stacy has, communicated with you all that, pretty much through the end of the month, we'll accept comments on this first draft before updating that and having a second draft ready in September. So hopefully having this adopted by council towards the end of the fall and in November is what we're hoping to stay on track for here. So another couple months of, continuing to build out this first draft and bring it to a final draft adopted by the city. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Pfeiffer with Planet Geo, our consultant. He'll kind of tee us up here. And I think I'll take one of the slides, kind of emphasizing what feedback we are looking for tonight, and let Chris run with it after that.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to present an update on the Urban Forest Management Plan for Issaquah, the first ever plan for the urban forest. And as Dan mentioned, my name is Chris Pfeiffer. I'm the Director of Urban Forestry Consulting at Planet Geo, going on 10 years coming in October as the Director and now the Project Manager for this management planning project. And just want to recognize my supporting staff, Alex and Matt, who are experienced in policy planning and management of trees in the Pacific Northwest, and they're certified arborists that bring insights and technical expertise to the plan. So what I'll do is I'll share an agenda, brief overview, and then turn it over to Dan on our request. And before doing that, though, I do want to recognize our time together in February that was a joint meeting with the board. There was feedback that you all provided that I hope you see in the plan that it's captured, and we will present on that to a degree and in the open discussion. Some of those feedback we received in February was around interested parties to engage with youth, schools, large landowners, looking at the holistic ecosystem approach with the understory, whether it's invasive or desirable vegetation, and that it's not just the trees, it's the entire urban environment ecosystem. And then also having information available, after this project on the city's website so that the community can take part in the shared vision for the urban forest. We also looked at ways to achieve the canopy goal with, free tree opportunities and what other cities are doing, like in Bellevue. A board member shared an example there. And we looked at how this plan aligns with other plans, looking at the clean energy initiatives in the comp plan, but also, of course, the climate action plan, Issaquah's ICAP. We looked at defining trees versus the forest as a whole, looking at individual trees in urbanized areas versus, the valuable forest that you're fortunate to have in Issaquah. Also, how this ties into stormwater management and green infrastructure and other initiatives and priorities in the city. And of course, the question that comes up oftentimes is funding and how to approach that with these new initiatives or ramping up planting to achieve a canopy goal. And then aligning also with the park system plan that's being updated currently. So that's just a quick overview. Really appreciate you weighing in and taking the time to read these extensive documents. And, you know, separate from the management plan itself is an 80-page tree data summary document. So some of the detail that may not be seen in the body of the plan will be in supporting studies and reference. So just keeping that in mind. So that's an overview where we were at, how we incorporated some of the feedback you shared. And what I'd like to present this evening is just going through an update, getting into our key findings, how that informed the long-term framework, and then a deeper dive into the canopy goal, the requirements to achieve such an ambitious goal. And then we want to have a lot of time for open discussion. And then as Dan mentioned, we'll at the end of the month be collecting your feedback. So I'm going to pause there, turn it over to Dan for the request that we'd like to make of the board, and then I'll get into the presentation.
Yeah, so kind of touched on this already and in the memo, but just to kind of reiterate, you know, we were looking for feedback from the environmental board on progress to date, which will be recapped a bit here. And Chris kind of recapped a bunch of that already. The vision statement and 5 guiding principles that really kind of structure the framework of the forest management plan, and canopy goal considerations, you know, specifically around the ICAP 55% goal. So any additional feedback in general of what to consider when, you know, working towards a final version of the USMP as that relates to the vision statement and guiding principles, and then kind of the next tier down, the goals, strategies, and recommendations. As I mentioned, kind of feedback on canopy goal implementation factors, and then certainly not less important, but you know, there's essentially a lot of data is in the current conditions in terms of the tree canopy assessment updates, the riparian canopy study, some of the vulnerability, you know, kind of discussion around our urban forest, preferred tree list, lots of stuff that Chris will kind of touch on briefly here. You know, if there's any feedback or kind of thoughts on that section too, we happily cover that. So we'll have a recapping slide of this at the end of the presentation too. So we'll come back to this before we jump into discussion.
And Dan, would you like feedback as we go, or would you like to wait until the end?
Chris, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question too. I think we'll keep the presentation brief so that your questions and thoughts won't get lost, and we'll make sure to spend enough time on those at the end if that works for the group. But if there's something pressing, feel free to interrupt.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So what I'll do now is just provide a brief overview of the timeline. It was already discussed, but as a visual, just to show the path that led us here to our presentation this evening. And so it always starts with, what do we have? The baseline assessment, as Dan mentioned, back in around October, November of 2023. But then we need to take what we're finding from the assessment and educate, and then also gather feedback and input in what the plan will entail and what the current conditions mean to the city staff as well as interested parties. And incorporating our planning processes and those findings along with the engagement findings into the long-term framework that was held just before this month, where we drafted those, and you'll see that incorporated in tonight's presentation. And then the plan development process, tying this all together, telling the story and providing the roadmap on how to achieve a shared vision for the urban forest. And as we go into this feedback period of the draft, we'll continue our presentations. We have a few more meetings with interested parties and incorporating that into draft number 2 in anticipation of the park board making a recommendation to city council to adopt the plan towards November of this year, and wrapping up the project by the end of the year. And so from our last discussion, we got feedback on how to engage the public in a survey and other means. And this is just a high-level summary that we're providing of the public survey. And from the results, you see that most participants were from Squaw Mountain neighborhood and Issaquah Highlands. And one thing that's unique from my experience of doing these is that most participants for Issaquah were between the ages of 35 to 55, with 40%, and 38% were over 55 years old. Oftentimes, it's more of the older demographics that participate in these surveys. So it's an interesting sign. And when we surveyed those participants about their interest in supporting a citywide canopy cover goal by planting trees on their own property, not just the city-led public plantings, 26% expressed strong interest in doing so. And that also tied into the University of Washington Evans School study that they were doing as part of concurrently with this planning project. And from the survey, we also gathered feedback on the concerns from the public. And some of those relate to invasive plant species, wildfires, harmful tree pests and diseases, and tree-related issues like sidewalk damage and potential limbs falling, as well as complications around tree permitting processes. And to address these concerns, we found that 74% of the public support management plan actions for green infrastructure development. 68% want increased tree planting in underserved areas, and 66% seek initiatives for tree care on private property. And public engagement initiatives that they'd like to see include volunteer events, workforce development, and citizen science, with 27% for that. So looking ahead, we see that 86% envision the urban forest as a refuge for wildlife, 76% want to enhance the environmental health, 71% desire an expanded green space where it's a network of connected green space for all communities. So you can see how that really ties into the canopy goal and some of the strategies that we'll discuss this evening. And as part of this planning process, as Dan mentioned, there was an update to the tree canopy assessment, and we completed that in 2023. It's an update to the 2019 assessment. And this assessment informs strategies to increase tree cover, prioritize specific areas, supporting what we've heard from the public. And from our last meeting in February, we discussed the riparian canopy assessment portion of the UTC, the urban tree canopy assessment. Now, this slide here summarizes what we found in terms of canopy cover change over a 10-year period. And from that time, 479 acres of canopy were gained, which is unique. And we can talk more about that. We have some potential causes for those gains. And the data summary report really hones in on where those changes happened at the neighborhood planning sub area as well, and also at the riparian corridor level. And so we also, on this slide, just summarize some of the key factors and considerations involved with these types of assessments, because this can serve as a baseline measurement going forward to measure plan progress. And as part of our request, we'd like to get your feedback on sections of the plan that was shared in preparation for this meeting this evening. And so this slide just provides an overview of some of the key components within the current conditions section of the plan. And we start with those tree-related assessments. We then describe the conditions of current management programs and the feedback we heard from city staff and interested parties, as well as the current and potential risks and vulnerabilities facing Issaquah's trees. Lastly, we tie this all together in an evaluation of all urban forestry components using industry standards and frameworks from the U.S. Forest Service to document where Issaquah is at now with the new urban forestry program, new staffing, and this plan, and where it will be in the future by implementing the plan. So we dive a little deeper, and this slide will provide an example of tree-related assessments in the plan's current conditions section. And one thing to note here is we utilize the assessment data from the Green Issaquah 20-year implementation guide, where we gained insights into the urban forest composition. Now, right now, the city does not have a comprehensive inventory of public trees along streets and in maintained areas of parks. So this data is really crucial for that first step of understanding the composition of trees across Issaquah. And so here we just see, we reworked some of the analyses to look specifically at the top 5 dominant overstory tree species, the dominant understory tree species, and the dominant invasive plant and tree species. And so that starts to paint a picture, but along streets and in maintained areas of parks differ from what grows naturally. So we'll want to look at recommendations around an inventory in the future to really provide those insights into making planting and management decisions. And one thing to note here is that from what we find with this data is that generally the forests appear relatively young, given that Douglas firs are more abundant compared to your western red cedars and hemlocks that typically, are late succession and maturing trees for a maturing forest. So now in the current conditions section, we also provide an example of how we evaluated current conditions with management plans and different programs and practices. So on the left, we have this table that summarizes key planning elements. And this includes a brief purpose statement about that plan, how the plan aligns or doesn't align with urban forest management, key statements that we found in those documents relating to urban forestry, and any areas where potential conflicts exist or conflicts that may arise if we do not properly address it in the management plan. And this is just paraphrased for presentation. And so then also we looked at, in the current conditions section, some of the existing and potential tree pests and diseases of concern. And this may have certain management implications. And so this slide just captures some of the concerns with Mediterranean oak borer and emerald ash borer. And we can talk more about the host species and potential risks relating to that, but it is those are primary pests of concern there. And just as a brief overview, this slide provides an example of how we examine vulnerability of trees in the region in terms of climate change. And we utilize the climate change response framework, which has these online tools to identify common street trees in the Pacific Northwest. And these are the trees that are least vulnerable to increased heat projections. So make sure you read the disclaimer at the bottom. This is not intended to serve as a tree planting list. You'll notice invasives on there, but it can show you what may, proliferate with changing conditions. And also wanted to recognize the city does emphasize planting natives and also to identify locally sourced seeds for, seedling plantings and other efforts. And lastly, for the highlights, I just wanted to discuss the findings from the U.S. Forest Service's urban forest audit and also the indicators of sustainable urban forest management. And just as a summary, this is where we document our findings, we score it, and then we can utilize that to develop strategies in the plan and also have that to serve as a monitoring mechanism. And so this slide just summarizes the various categories of those elements. And here's an example of the elements pertaining to the trees. Then we also have elements pertaining to management and the people that are influencing and benefiting from the urban forest. And those elements are ranked on a low to moderate to good score. And it's based on our findings, industry standards, local context, and also input from the city staff and interested parties. And so as a result of this process, we find that each category is then scored, and we're able to utilize this to develop strategies. And I just wanted to point out that this score was expected for a new urban forestry program with the first ever urban forest management plan in development with new staffing. So this is a starting point, and there's some nuance to this, but it's a good starting point from which you can measure progress. And so I covered this a little bit on the previous slides, but this long-term framework was informed by our planning process, and the audit is a culmination of the findings from this planning process. And just to really bring this home and to illustrate how, we're not just pulling these goals and strategies out of the air, it's really an iterative process informed by data and interested parties. And so we have the long-term framework consisting of the vision, principles, goals, strategies, and smart actions. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a monitoring and implementation component to this plan where the indicators and the audit serve as a foundation for that monitoring, and will provide the guidance on how to do that, how to reevaluate, how to apply adaptive management to make sure this is a living, working document for you all to utilize. over the next 10 years. And so what I'll do now is this is the only time I'll read off the slide, and I think it's important to read the vision. And this was developed in part by city staff and interested parties, again, gathering those vision preferences from the public survey and from other engagement meetings. And so this roadmap towards a sustainable urban forest is led by this vision. And it reads, Issaquah envisions a thriving urban forest where a diverse and cared for tree canopy strengthens our community for generations to come. This verdant tapestry will enhance our livability, promote health and well-being, support wildlife and habitat, and contribute to a sustainable future for all. And so that, to me, starts to exemplify the passion around urban forestry. It's a shared vision that is needed to achieve, canopy goals and the ambitious goals in the plan. But as I mentioned, this was supported from the engagement with staff and the public. And so we just called to attention some of those related feedback items that were shared. And so I'll be wrapping up here with the long-term framework. This was already provided in the plan and as a PDF, so I won't read these, but those 5 guiding principles serve as a compass because trees are in an ever-changing environment. There's going to be new changes to resources, priorities. You're going to adapt strategies as things change, but these will be your beacon to stay heading towards the vision. And so those guiding principles are then supported by the goals for each of those 5 categories. And so they are numbered. Each strategy within the goal are numbered, so they're easy to reference and circle back to when making updates or creating progress reports or sharing with interested parties where you're at with the plan. And the action tables in the plan will really get into the detail around how to accomplish those goals. And lastly, for this presentation, we'd like to provide additional details and considerations for the canopy goal that, as you all know, was established in the Issaquah Climate Action Plan, the ICAP. And so based on industry standards, our local considerations, the findings from the management plan, we incorporated and developed a series of scenarios and targets that detail how the city would achieve 55% canopy cover by 2035. And those scenarios also looked at different canopy goals, different timelines, different variations in the large trees that are planted, small trees. And so the next slide talks about some of those inputs. But here we see some of the high-level requirements and milestones for achieving that goal. So in short, approximately 16,000 trees are needed over the next 10 years to increase canopy cover by 4%. So we'll talk a little bit about those inputs, and then we'll wrap up the presentation and get into discussion. So that 16,000 tree estimate is based on factors and considerations that we prepared with input from the city, as well as interested parties. And as I mentioned, these dynamic living organisms are always changing. And so there isn't a one method approach to, calculate your canopy goal and what the requirements are. But we had these inputs to help shape that realistic canopy goal and the way to implement it. And so here we see 51% canopy is based on the current canopy of 51% is based on the 2023 assessment using 2021 imagery. 16,000 trees are needed, but this means that existing canopy is replaced if lost. We incorporated Title 18's canopy requirements, which was co-developed by Planet Geo with the city in 2022. So we're leveraging that work into the canopy implementation process. We applied average canopy diameters for small, medium, and large trees according to U.S. Forest Service's iTree research. And that we also incorporated there will be deciduous and coniferous trees planted, and that a fairly even split of large, medium, and small canopy trees at maturity will be planted. Also, as a shared commitment to this urban forest vision, we envision 75% of plantings led by the city and 25% through partners, property owners, community associations, and by other interested parties. And other factors that go into implementation were considered as well. You know, of course, the costs, and we'll get into more of that in the implementation and monitoring section of the plan. We also looked at the data that's needed for evaluating progress over time, as well as what is needed in the management plan itself to guide this implementation towards that canopy cover goal. So that's an overview of the project to date. I started off with the timeline and key updates, you know, looking at the public survey, the canopy assessment that was conducted in 2023, some of the key sections of the current conditions of the plan, and these inform the long-term framework that we provided an overview of, from the vision and guiding principles to the goals and actions. So in the coming weeks, we're going to meet again with the Snoqualmie tribe, and that'll round out the draft reviews, and we'll use this feedback to prepare draft number 2. We'll then continue our presentations with boards and committees in September and October. And again, we're aiming for a city council adoption in November of this year. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for your attention and for the opportunity to present an update. It's been great working with Dan and the city on this important effort. A lot of key interesting things that came out of this that stand out with over 50 management planning projects that I've worked on. And so it's really been a pleasure working with you all. And I mean that honestly. And so before getting into open discussion, just going to recap our request, and maybe it doesn't need to be read off and we can turn to open discussion. But Dan, is there anything else to cover before we move to that?
No, I don't think so. So obviously any kind of key questions, clarifications, obviously we'll receive comments the time we have on the agenda tonight. But like I said, anything that you can share electronically with Stacy, she will summarize and get to Chris and I here towards the end of the month, or early September, I believe. And like I said, I'm happy to chat more about this, you know, one-on-one always. And, you know, we can talk to as if this, you know, something the board wants to see as a second version of the draft coming back to, we can see if that we can fit that into. So just want to let you know, there's still a lot of kind of touch points here over the next 2 months or so before we do try to kind of finalize this and move this through council. You are our first public outreach on the draft here too. So
Good to hear. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chris. Nancy.
I just have a couple of questions. So you had talked about not having numbers of street trees. You haven't assessed those, or trees that are in parks. So if you don't have that assessment, how does that fit into the canopy numbers that you were talking about? Are you just doing it from overhead, from aerial photographs? Is that how you're doing it? So when you talk about where we are with our current canopy, those trees are included in terms of their coverage?
Yes.
So we don't know the species of them and the condition of them and that type of thing. So
yeah.
that's just one question. And the second question I have for you is, I know at times we've talked to you about how PSC's contractor comes through and does their things. Did you do any outreach to PSC or get any involvement from their contractor that moves trees in the city? I didn't see it in the plan.
No, that's a really good question, Nancy, and not specifically around the plan. I've been working with PSE and EPA around some utility clearing they have been doing in essentially Tradition Plateau and kind of up by Central Park. So we are tracking that better now because that information is now coming through me. It is interesting. Essentially, they kind of come to you telling you what is going to be removed. There is a way to get compensated for some of those tree removals, which is interesting and something we're looking at pursuing too. But, you know, in terms of the best practices, things like that, I mean, we are like, you know, kind of trusting their team, their arborists, but I have not seen the conditions that, you know, maybe look like the bad outcomes versus, you know, these are considered high danger trees with the, you know, utility lines. So that information is being shared. For instance, you know, I don't know if they've actually done the work yet, but we got notification that, you know, between Central Park and Tradition Plateau, there's about 15 to 20 trees coming out, but 2/3 or so of those are dead trees right now. So that's, you know, at least the tracking, I would say. I feel like we've made a contact and being clear that I'd like that to come through me moving forward in terms of anything that goes into the management recommendations.
They don't have to get a tree permit.
There's utility exemptions. Yeah.
I was
So
just curious. I
you're
didn't know if you
supposed
could-
to essentially notify me that does relate to our public works team too. And that's something I'm trying to better kind of organize, communicate around too. So they don't need a permit. They're still expected to replace those trees. And that kind of gets into some of these goals around needing to better identify receiving sites. It's done very ad hoc right now in terms of, all right, 2 trees, where could we put 2 trees in the same sub area? And it's can be pretty tedious to just kind of get those requests, especially if they're kind of short notice. Hey, we need to get this submitted. We need to have somewhere to put it in. Those generally come through parks, even though parks are often not the ones leading those projects. So I'd say that's been kind of tricky, but yeah, the utility stuff for PSE, my understanding that hasn't been the requirement, but for our public works team or the rarer occasion, the parks is moving right away trees for safety or utility conflicts that is expected to be replaced.
Thanks for the answer to the question. But I just have one general piece of feedback on the plan. I haven't read it in detail. One of the confusing things to me when I read it is the discussion of tree equity. Because equity is such a buzzword in this town right now in terms of what city's putting out. A lot of it's housing equity, other kinds of equity, and calling something tree equity is really starting to muddy the water. And maybe it's a common term in the tree world, but you might want to find something else so that you're not conflicting it with housing equity and transportation equity and food and all that other equity that's going on. It just really, when I looked at it, I says, now how does equity work with trees?
Sure.
That's just a general piece of feedback, and it may be the right way to go.
That's great feedback, and Chris maybe can add to this a little bit more, but there is American Forest is a national organization. Probably familiar, and they're the ones that created this tool, essentially a tree equity tool, which is what is cited in the forest management plan. So it is taking in some of those kind of socioeconomic demographic factors for sure. But more simply, it is a tool to sort of prioritize where to best plant trees based on some of those potential shortcomings. And it is interesting. I mean, for Issaquah, we have a pretty high overall tree equity score at 93, but then there are certain neighborhoods where that is significantly lower in the low 80s, 83, I think for South Cove, Central Issaquah, Highland, I think Lakeside are the 4 areas that have lower scores, I think in the 80s generally. So the way I've seen it used, and once again, yeah, how we define it, how we talk about it, but in terms of a kind of functional use of it, it's a lot of these cities, David and I have actually had some of these conversations. We'll use that tool as a prioritization for tree giveaways and applications. So, if they get more applications than trees available, Bellevue, I believe, is one of those that has been using that tool to kind of prioritize how they distribute their trees, and also just for our public tree plantings too, knowing that those are areas we really should kind of emphasize, prioritize, and better plan for. So the equity conversation I hear, but that just hope that provides more context on how the tools used and where it came from.
That was just feedback because we were reading the comp plan at the same time, and there's a lot of conversation now about equity. And so when you're reading 2 documents in the same month, in the same weeks, you really see some confusion that could happen to the public. That's just my feedback.
Gosh.
Hi Dan, hi Chris, I'm Raj, and I have a few questions and just some feedback. So one of the things I noticed, and I'm not sure if I missed it, but I looked at the draft plan and I didn't see anywhere where tree canopy was defined, like with what exact definition of tree canopy is. I think the introduction needs to have that. I did read somewhere it was 14 feet height or some other stuff. And you can find the bits and pieces, but it needs to be defined in the introduction. The second question was the 55% goal by 2035. Is this just on the city property, city roads? It includes the private properties and the entire city. Okay. So that's good to know. So that also, I think, needs to be clearly stated somewhere in the introduction part, so it's clear going forward what to expect. And so that's good to know, because I looked at, and I think cost somewhere on the presentation slides, I noticed that there was a 490,000 per year cost of maintenance or planting trees. And you mentioned that there are 16,000 trees to be planted. So my question was, if it's also on residential properties for the whole community, then is there, first question is, where does the funding for this come from? Is it just the city, or is there some taxpayers' money, or is there different tax, or how does it work?
Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, it is a pretty high price tag on that last slide, but I guess the caveat to that would be putting in what is listed as caliper trees or large, often ball and burlap. You know, they have 1 to 2 inch diameter trees, and those easily can cost $300 to $400 to $500 a piece. And then, you know, some of the installation costs associated with that too. So that I would say is about as high end of an estimate, because we do plant a lot of trees that are smaller containers or even bare roots, or what we call live stakes, which are cuttings of trees, especially in a lot of our natural areas. And that plant material is a lot cheaper, in the $5 to $10 to maybe $15 per tree or per plant there. So there's a little more context on that kind of cost estimate. But yes, that is for essentially installation and plant material. There's still a maintenance cost associated with that as well, that is not as directly reflected in there, whether that's, you know, the watering, pruning, things that trees need, you know, young ages, and then certainly as they mature too. To your question on the funding sources, yes, I mean, that's a difficult one. There's certainly some really good urban forestry programs. There's a lot more that the state and the federal government are kind of pumping into those type of programs. So I do believe there are. So yes, they're taxpayer, but not necessarily coming out of Issaquah's general fund or Issaquah's tax base. So like for instance, our tree inventory is something we're hoping to fund by the state's DNR's, Department of Natural Resources Urban Forestry program. There's some programs through county as well, and then stuff that's kind of coming through EPA to urban forestry. But that's stuff we do need to strategize and kind of relates to guiding principle.
So I had a suggestion on that, you know, if there is a deficit to be matched. And I don't know if that's necessarily a question for Dan. It could be for Stacy, or it may be a interdepartmental for the city, but the new developments, and I don't know this, the new developments which are coming up, because usually do they have a requirement of, you know, some green areas or plantings or green belts maintenance going forward because of the climate initiatives. And so I'm wondering if some part of that, you know, that planting cost could be over, especially over 10 years, or long-term goals could be transferred to the new development, either as a part of the investment in, you know, your climate initiatives, or as a part of incentive for, you know, doing a green development with city, and they get some perks because they're doing a green development. So that is something to consider or look at, because I know some of the, especially with the LEED, you know, your LEED certifications, a lot of buildings want to do more of the green planting areas and stuff like that. So I don't know, that is something under consideration, but that could be something which will be checked. That would be, thank you.
And Don, Keith is not showing up here, but Keith does have his hand raised.
Okay. All right, Keith, I'll get to you after I get to the table here. Jamie?
Thanks, Don. One of the questions, like, it would be, Chris touched on that we've added, I think, like 480 acres or some amount of tree canopy in the last, whatever the time period, I think it was 2011.
10 years.
Yeah, it would be great. One of the things I didn't really get from reading through was kind of one, any learnings from that we would be applying to what we're going to do going forward, because that seems like a fairly good increase in canopy. And two, kind of best practices, or like, and this might not end up in the final plan, but I just don't remember having heard like what we see from neighboring jurisdictions that has really worked. And I'm sure Don probably has a bunch of ideas from Bellevue, but I'm like, that's something that I'd be curious, like best practices around urban forest management that we've, and I'm sure Chris, and I'm sure that's all coming in, but I'm curious on the, like, what's our kind of, what are the parallels, what are the cities we're looking at that are kind of our peer group that we want to really aspire to be like. So just something that maybe is context for the forest management plan. Maybe it's not in the actual plan, but something that might be helpful. One question I had was, I noticed that the park board was going to be the one making the final recommendation on this. Is this going to be a plan that they're most closely tied to? I guess I'm surprised that this wouldn't be an environmental board like topic area.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's somewhat based on my position,
Yeah.
my role being based in parks, the fact that, you know, our public land, 1,500 plus acres is part of parks and open spaces. Parks does manage, not that the park board necessarily touches on it much, but parks manages a pretty good majority of right of ways and trees in the built environment too. I mean, I should say it's a pretty healthy mix between parks and public works, but it's part of parks responsibility too. So that's sort of what I've been following by leadership, but you know, if that's something that we can talk about, or I don't want to mess up schedules too much, but if that's something that September we're able to bring both those boards together again, for recommendations on the second draft, I mean, that's something we're certainly open to, so.
Yeah, and I think that's one topic, I think the ongoing piece, because I think it sends a kind of a strange mess, like Parks Board, their knowledge and what they focus on most of parks, and some of parks is green space, but they're not really, they're also talking about fields and things that are explicitly not canopy. So I just think it would be kind of, it would be strange, especially because so much of this is tied to the ICAP and the canopy goals as well as wildlife. It just seems like a weird mix that, I think the short term is one thing, but the ongoing, like, this is just something, a topic that I feel like this board should be really engaged upon. And so plus we get to see Dan more, so I think it's an but I just think that's something that Stacy and Dan, I would just ask you guys to go and ask that question. Is it really right that it probably is based on reporting? Is that the right answer for how this should work? And then I had a question similar to Praj, which around like the definition of canopy. Because I think at one point you had said that canopy doesn't typically count until 5 to 10 years from planting. Is that?
Yeah, and that's that 14-foot requirement. Yes,
Okay.
A lot of trees we plant today.
And so is our 55% goal, everything needs to be above that height? Because I guess I'm thinking back 10 years from 2035 is next year, which implies that we basically need to have all the trees in the ground that we would need. So that's where I'm trying to, like, I understand that we're getting the trees in the ground with this plan, but it doesn't actually hit timeline to that. I'm just curious on.
Yeah, so Chris can clarify, but my understanding is part of the reason we modeled that using caliper trees or kind of larger, what we'd kind of often refer to as street trees. You know, those are often 6, 7, even 8 feet to start. So those can achieve that canopy status a lot quicker than, you know, some of the bare root or 1 or 2 gallon trees that we plant, you know, along the creek and places like this. So that 5 to 10 years is a rough estimate, but yes, to your point, I mean, it does get to a point, you know, trees are planting and probably 2031, 2, 3, 4, 5 are not going to be contributing to that. But a lot of what I believe is modeled, you know, based on the square footage of large, medium, you know, kind of these general buckets of size of trees is with the anticipation that those are growing and you know, contributing to that target. Plus, you know, some of the stuff that we've already obviously planted in the last 5 or so years, 10 years, if not. Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
There's a lag.
Yeah, no, and I'm just curious if, I think we're saying in the plan that we have a plan to get to the 50%. I'm not actually, and maybe someone's run the numbers on this, but it seems like we might not actually be able to get there even with that. Even if we hit that plan, we might not get it.
It is ambitious. I don't want to say we can't, but I mean, there's considerations around cost, feasibility, timeframes, and then certainly other factors that relates to, you know, which we touch on the plan, wildfire preparedness, you know, defensible space, things that the state building code is working on and could have some big implications on development and redevelopment and Issaquah in the near future here.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then I had just 2 other points. One, I know some of the current conditions started to touch on like what the plannable area and just kind of what within riparian areas and other kind of high important areas, like critical areas and otherwise, like that was a part of the current conditions. I didn't see that as heavily, and I know it's draft, but a lot of the goals and strategies that are like, we have the 55% goal. We don't, and we talk about priority areas. Priority areas is never defined. That's probably something I'm assuming will happen at some point. But to me, priority areas are things like riparian areas, the things that are going to really critically like impact areas that there's lots of wildlife, biodiversity. That to me, that didn't come through in the current goals and strategies. So that's something I think really needs to be. And I do want to make sure like we talk a lot about tree equity, which I understand, but at the same time, I think we need to be thinking as well about where is it going to have the most kind of habitat value? Where is canopy going to, like around streams where it's going to be reducing water temperatures? Those are considerations that I feel like are getting maybe shoved aside a little bit, I think should be a really important considerations that we have to consider all the other things, but that just feels like it's not as central as maybe it should be within what it's a draft, but within what's currently there.
That's really good feedback, and I would say that was certainly the impetus of why we wanted to include a riparian subset to the tree canopy analysis, essentially establish a baseline.
Yeah.
With most of these analysis, you are doing current data, which once again, there's a lag of the LiDAR being available and the high resolution to, so essentially everything we're talking about, yes, is 2011 to 2021. For riparian, we use 2017 as a baseline year since we already had a lot of the, that's what we use for the original tree canopy assessment. But yes, I agree that I think that's something, Chris, we can and should chat about, are we setting, goals around riparian canopy? Obviously, we have recommendations to continue to track that, but to what end, I think.
Yeah, because what I would hate to see happen is like, it's only looking at neighborhood level. We're only trying to prioritize in the neighborhoods, but we're not looking at where is there actually high value. Like, I think that's one of the things that, I forget that with the sewer master plan, or where they were focusing on critical areas for where they were going to try to get septic migrated to sewer, like that. I thought was a great way, like a great parallel here of like, how do we make sure that the highest value areas that we can get canopy for the environment for flora and fauna, that was going to happen. And then one thing that Tom, I think, brought up last time this came through, that I didn't see mentioned was how to de-risk planting trees for developers and commercial, like people that are larger landowners, because they might see it as something once they plant it, they could never develop that space, or they decreasing the value of their land. So that's something that it seems like there might be opportunity there to evaluate and talk to some business owners, talk to some large landholders that have commercial properties to see if that is a concern, because I think that would be a huge, if there's something, and I don't know what the right mechanism is, but if there's a way to help de-risk planting trees, if they're seeing that as a barrier because they think it's a potential, something they can't come back from, and that they would devalue their land, that I think is a big potential upside. And then the last thing is, I know we talk about tree selection. One of the things that, Dan, you will know this 1,000 times better than anyone in this room, but I think that there is a correlation between conifers having better ability to keep out invasives, especially for riparian, than deciduous. And so I do think this in some of our areas, that's something to consider, is like long-term habitat kind of sustainability or ability to repel invasives, and you would know that better. That's something I think isn't mentioned that maybe should be mentioned or considered in the selection of trees.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes discussion left, so if you don't mind, Jonathan.
Just make this quick. I'm just kind of curious on how this works. You're going to take this plan to the council this fall. Are you requesting a budget this fall?
No, the main budget item that we have requested, that process is already underway. We did have the first touch point with the SSP, we can spell that out, the Safety Services and Parks Subcommittee of our council, just a few weeks ago, is for a tree inventory. And we're hoping to be able to fund most of that with grant funds, but that's the main item we're putting in. There will need to be conversations on getting creative around finances for some of these other kind of short-term goals.
So will you have a commitment? Are you trying to get a commitment for a 10-year plan? Or is it going to be something that needs to be taken to the board, the council every year?
That's a good question. And I mean, that's the type of feedback that we'd love to hear. I mean, I think we are looking at a commitment for a 10-year plan, but is there a, kind of 5-year audit we want to look at, or, kind of what are the intervals? We talked about intervals for some of the metric updates, like the urban tree canopy. Once we have a tree inventory, I mean, there's recommendations around how often you're trying to update some of that data as it relates to individual trees. But that's a really good question. Yeah, I was not the impression we'd be taking it for like reapproval every year or 2 years, but essentially trying to revisit progress, as Chris kind of talked about, adaptive management, possibly, shifting goals and approaches as needed based on, current conditions and then new data and stuff like that. But, I think it would follow a little bit like ICAP, where you all just went through the kind of the mid 5-year, kind of review. So I could see there being a similar process to that. We do see a lot of cities that have been developing these plans a little bit longer, doing their our 10-year updates already. So I mean, I think that would be the next major update.
So if this gets approved, will you have any budget to start planting trees next year?
Some, but maybe not as much as we hope or need to reach some of those guaranteed scenarios around the 55% goal. That's just kind of the reality of what I've heard from some of our leadership, but without getting too much into.
So you'll have to work to get some grants. You're gonna go into grant search mode.
Yeah, and we already are kind of starting that, like I said, around the tree inventory, around plant material. We do have our tree fund, which we're gonna try to better utilize, which we've seen essentially developers paying into that when they can't meet tree canopy retention or planting requirements. So but yeah, it's limited in terms of meeting that specific 55% goal with the projection there. But it's not to say we don't have anything or there are ways to get creative about that for grants.
It just seems like you need to start planting trees today, or as soon as this gets approved to meet your 55% goal. All right, that's it.
Got it, Bob?
So 16,000 trees planted and 11,000 and something city-led planting. Do you have the next level of breakdown of like where you're going to squeeze all those in? Is that part of the plan or is that left as an implementation detail?
That's a bit more of an implementation detail, but Chris, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, thank you. And I did also want to note that Keith Gonzalez had a question. So, but I just want to provide a visual. This is from an earlier assessment through King County, but here we're looking at Issaquah. And so this just gives a visual of some of the priorities and what we're incorporating in the implementation section of the plan is a tiered approach. You have the citywide, possibly the neighborhoods and planning sub areas, drilling down to different themes like, shade over riparian corridors, looking at connectivity that we heard, wildlife, biodiversity, stormwater management, and then using these data sets to look at more localized priority areas. And these will be maps as well as GIS files for the city to utilize, overlay with other shape files, other layers to really see where the conflicts are and where those opportunities will be. So yeah, there is another step to this when we finalize the long-term framework is those supporting studies and the implementation aspect. And on the side of costs, we will be providing an extensive analysis and summary of funding mechanisms from the local level all the way through to some of the examples Dan shared at the state and federal level, because that is going to be a challenge. And then lastly, just wanted to mention, this is escaping me now, the planting per year is an average. We know that cities need to scale up efforts, and then keeping in mind that those lower cost items like the live stakes, seedlings, and other means, not just large caliper trees. So a lot more that we can share, but hopefully that helps with the implementation question that was asked about, like more of a localized, more granular level or granular level of priority area. So I'll get this online GIS map off your screen, but that was hopefully to provide a visual that there are a lot of factors that will go into priority areas.
Okay, well, I didn't have kind of a follow-on that relates to that. Now, I know that detail we're not going to get to, but there's a particular property that's close to where I live, and I'll just use it as an example. The former Hope property on Front Street South, the city has owned it for like 10 years or so, and the city is gradually turning it into a blackberry farm. Well, okay, by default, because that's what happens. All right, so there's a perfect example of a city-held piece of property which could be enhanced with some tree planting on it. So I would hope that that would be somewhere on the list of areas to plant. But it then leads me to another point that, okay, maybe there needs to be a new little step somewhere in the process of city acquisition of land, a tree canopy evaluation when the property is evaluated that would trigger a step of, well, hey, yeah, we have an opportunity here and we should do some planning. So that's kind of a separate process from this overall urban forest management plan, but it would help address situations like that, where, okay, we've acquired this parcel, and rather than just sitting there doing nothing with it, let's take this opportunity to trigger that step to cause some tree planting in the near term rather than many years later. So that's one suggestion. My next question is how this is going to, how ladder fuel reduction will factor into this plan, or is that, do you envision that as something, we're not mature enough in our tree planning to start talking about that, and we'll do that as a subsequent step, or?
I think that's part of the adaptive management. Essentially, we're referring in here to this plan to some of the state building code updates that have been proposed and subsequently delayed a bit in terms of defining that wildland urban interface. If you saw the first map that came out for that DNR put together kind of for a different intention, but then got used for defensible space, it's essentially all of Issaquah. So I mean, it's theoretical if that were to be followed, that, you know, 10 feet to 30 feet from buildings, we're just not gonna have tree branches or trees. So that would be pretty monumental if that's where it happens. But I think, you know, part of the delay, in my understanding, we're working a lot with Jared Schneider, who's the city's emergency response manager. He's really the one tracking a lot of this, is to just, you know, have a better understanding of, you know, when those things are phased in, what they look like. But I think right now they really are trying to better fine tune that map of wildland urban phase. There's certainly a lot of parts of the city that should and will qualify, but then some of the core spots, whether we need to have that strict of defensible space standards, a lot of that is at the state level and not necessarily city decisions. We're really just tracking that at this point. So,
You know, I mean, if we went really gung ho on the ladder fuel reduction, you could completely erase whatever gains. Or
no, it's tricky.
Thing. And as soon as we have a wildfire somewhere on the slopes of Squawk or Tiger, it's going to be the most important thing suddenly. But it's a factor that I worry about anyway, and we're going to have to find a way to balance that out. That's all I got.
Thank you, Tom. I do want to recognize our last two comments. So Kieran and then Keith, and then we're going to end this.
Yeah, hi. So during the survey, a very large percentage of the survey respondents were over the age of 35. So I was wondering if there was any intention on doing on altering the surveys to get younger audiences' opinions.
Yeah, that's a good question. We did try to meet with some groups. We brought this to Issaquah Garage and kind of got feedback that way. I'm not sure how many of them actually submitted the survey, but we had a kind of focus group there of about 5 to 10 high school age students as part of the team garage there. We did a lot of work with Gibson Eck, and actually one of your current members who's not here, Mina June, was an intern with our urban forestry program along with other Gibson Eck students. So we did try to bring this to them both in kind of conversation presentations and also tried to kind of share the survey. I don't know how successful, like I said, it was getting survey results, but we did try to kind of tap into a few kind of youth group connections we had, but I'll admit that was an area that was probably a bit lacking.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah. All right, Keith.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question about the Forest Service standards that you brought up as kind of a metric to grade the program on. I was sorry if I missed it. Is that kind of a real guiding light for the program, or is it just a helpful benchmark? I was wondering if there's any mechanisms for accountability to that.
Yeah, I'll take the question, Dan, if that's all right.
That's great.
Yeah, so it more to the latter, it's a supporting evaluation in what we're recommending in the plan. So we first go through all of the other processes of developing the plan, the planning processes, and gathering those inputs, and then summarizing each of those along the way. And we start to see these trends and commonalities along each planning element, whether it be more inclusive or more encompassing engagement, whether it be best practices for maintenance and management, better planting protocols and post-planting care. Those things start to rise above to the surface. And then when we do those audits, those evaluations, that's kind of a gut check to see, did we miss anything? And through that qualitative assessment, see like, whoa, this category is very low. Where are we addressing that with what we've heard and how the strategies are being shaped? So that is, yeah, it's a supporting tool. It's based on initially back in 1997, a model of urban forest sustainability, where we have those categories of the trees, the management, the people. And then in 2011, it was adapted to the criteria and indicators of sustainable urban forestry. And so now today, 2024, we've modified and adapted and updated those audits to be more specific and relevant to urban forestry today. So it's evolving. And the last thing I'll mention is that we are working it into the monitoring aspect of the plan, because, you know, if you document your methodology for scoring from low, moderate to good on that table that I shared, then as a team, like the city, which is really cool to see, has the tree team across multiple departments. As you all convene, maybe that's the group plus these boards, and say, where are we at now? And well, this is low, but I think we're at moderate, and have that discussion. It's a learning opportunity, update that score. And now that's a progress report that you can share with the public and interested parties. So a long-winded answer, but that really is the heart of Planet Geo's planning process. So I'm glad you asked that, Keith.
Thank you, Chris. I have several comments for you, but for the sake of time, I will email you those. Although one point that we should mention is there's been comment both by the public, and I think you heard it at our last meeting here, about the importance of the understory and the nexus to the overall forest. I'd like to see more emphasis on that, along with the forest edge, on how that plays in. Thank you.
And so next steps for the board, I will send out a reminder, but we're looking for any written feedback by the evening of the 2nd. And then we'll be compiling that into a letter to send out for review and approval with submission to Dan on the.
Is that same letter going to go to council, or is that going to be?
That will go to the park board, and then will be included in packets to council or the council committee.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all for your time. Take care.
With that, we'll roll right into our next topic, and we're talking about the draft comprehensive plan. Stephen's here to talk to us about it tonight. There's a memo that you were given in your packet. We're going to be reviewing the memo, just general themes on the memo, and then there's an attachment that Stephen created for us that gets into more of the details. Stacy, did you want to start us off with this?
Yeah, so the way we are planning to approach this tonight is first, Dawn and I were going to talk through some of the major themes that we heard from the board on the non-environment element section. So we're going to focus there first, and we want to make sure that we're accurately capturing high-level summary and those themes. And then we were going to move into the environment element and walk through those comments one by one. First, starting with those that David and I thought might be best moved to a conversation when we start updating the ICAP. That's for discussion. And then we would move through the other ones to get agreement from the board on what changes you want to see now in the environment. So a bit of a three-part discussion. First, non-environment element, make sure we're summarizing correctly, and then move into the environment element that we'll divide into two sections of conversation. That work for folks? This is a little complicated, so we've been trying to figure out the best way to present all this. So. Okay. And this is very blurry for the group. Stephen, you're on with us? Great. All right. So Stephen's here to help answer questions. Okay. Well, first I did want to just say thank you very much. I know board members spent a lot of time reviewing the document, provided some really great feedback, and staff have gone through all that feedback. We want to make sure we're accurately reflecting that feedback as the comprehensive plan is going to the Planning Policy Commission as well as to the council later this fall. So we'll just walk through maybe a summary of what we captured from the board's feedback. Don, do you want me to do that, or do you want to?
You can.
Okay.
Walk through it by element, like we discussed.
Yeah.
Can you put that document on the screen, starting with the end use?
Sure.
So the overall themes we heard from the board on the land use element were sustainability focus, having the comp plan be truly sustainable towards the natural environment. We're defining productive capacity of high quality natural areas and considering if this should fully focus on land use or integrated elsewhere. Policy clarity and integration. Terminology and policy focus with land use section need view to avoid conflicts, ensure alignment with sustainability goals, with clear language on tree management, wildlife cohabitation, and rainwater capture. Development strategies, exploring diverse strategies for increasing neighborhood density beyond cluster housing. Assess policies on walkability and equity to ensure they align with the broader development goals. Neighborhood standards, updating the standards to support effective density increases in neighborhoods while maintaining environmental considerations. And wildlife and habitat inclusion, ensuring wildlife habitat policies are integrated throughout the relevant areas. These are the general themes that we plan to include in the letter that goes forward. I read them because it's very hard to read up there. So if these are accurate, I think we can agree that this will be in our letter that's going to the
PPC and
okay.
subsequently to council committee.
Now, grayed out below that are details around the land use element, and those have been provided to Stephen, and he's looking at those in a much larger table with some other comments. But I don't know that we want to put that in this letter in this level of detail. We talked about last night, Stephen and Stacy and I met, was to have the general themes in our letter and then provide Stephen with the details, and he can put them into his appendix. It's a spreadsheet. We could look at that as well if you'd like. So have we captured your general concerns on the land use? Nancy?
I'm going to express my concerns about that approach.
Okay.
And the reason I do that is most of the comments we provided to Stephen were no change. We received a response of no change. And many of us took the time to try and put those comments down. And it's important that PPC sees those in their entirety from this board, because that's what we're asked to do, as does the council. So putting those into just the table that Stephen responds to me is not a complete. You can attach it as a separate thing that's not as highlighted. But I would really propose that we continue to provide those as our comments.
Stephen, would you like to speak to that?
If the board would like to provide the full table, we can. We just wanted to make sure we had the full discussion with the board on everything and separate out what goes in the letter from this more specific comments.
How do you plan to present your spreadsheet, Stephen, with all the specific comments?
If the spreadsheet gets added to get what gets sent to the Planning Policy Commission, it would be an attachment to the letter.
What would the board like to see? Looking for suggestions.
I would like to see them included in the whole. I think we did a lot of work on this. We spent a lot of time on this as a board. I think it's important that we express our.
Well, so maybe let's make sure I understand what we're saying here. Like item talks about making sure we maintain walkability. Is that the entire expressing what we captured in the more detailed table, including things about improving multimodal transportation? Walkability isn't that. It's more than that. So if that is the distilling of that, I'd say we've lost too much information in that transformation. So it needs to be either more detailed in that presentation, or as Nancy suggests, well, here, let's just capture all that we have here, and then that can be fodder for that analysis by whoever. But I feel has been some loss of information.
And so Nancy, in your proposal, is that section on the bottom going to be included in that way, or is it in line?
I would say it in that way. I mean, it's part of, our comments and feedback on it. It's another page and a half of materials.
Mhm. Oh, sorry, I was more of a question for Nancy. I was just curious how, I mean, I think I would support including it as long, I do think that if we should make it clear, like if they're only going to read one part of it, what do we want to make sure that we get across? And so I do think alignment on those top 5 is still important, but showing our work is great as well to get the detailed feedback.
I'm going to propose we take a quick vote, just so we have it captured. So I'm going to make a motion. We vote on keeping it in the format as is, or reducing it down to just the general themes. Second.
I'll second that.
So for all of those that would like to see the letter kept with all the details, so pretty much as is, as it reads there, please give me a sign up. It's like we have man, so Stacy. So I think our desire is to keep the letter as is with the details in it. That's not quite what we discussed last night, but I do believe after hearing Nancy and other comments of the board, that's the intent of the board is looking.
Stephen, any concerns with that? Anything else we can do to package this for PPC that would be helpful as staff meet with them?
I think what I might do is, if the preference from the board is to keep all the detail with the themes, is that was voted on, is keep the themes and the detail?
So keep the letter
Okay.
as drafted, yeah.
Then to also provide PPC with the same matrix that we provided the board as well. And that would be the attachment to the letter.
So the letter would read as is plus the attachment.
Correct.
Any other comments on that? I think we can drop down to the environmental element, or we're going to have the majority of our discussion.
Great. Yeah, I think what we were gonna do for the other conversation was move through the rest of the themes in the document. I don't think we need to do that now since we're gonna include the level of detail. What we'd like to do is go through the details of the environment element, and where there's things that we can address and resolve in the environment element. Our proposal, we'd remove those from the letter because they will be revised in the next version. And then after we do that, would like to get the okay on this letter tonight if possible, because I know Stephen would like to try and get it to PPC tomorrow, which is faster than we had originally planned. So with that, what I will do is move to a different document. And as mentioned, we'd first like to start with the recommendations from the board that staff felt after a quick review that we could address as part of the next update to the ICAP. And therefore not for consideration within this version of the comp plan, but they would be flagged for discussion with the board next year when we'd have more time to talk about them and incorporating them into the ICAP. And then next we'll move into those that we felt like we should bring for discussion tonight for immediate edits to the environment element. So first, to start with those, we felt could, or the staff recommendation is to punt to the 2025 review of the ICAP would be those that were proposed. I think John brought some really great suggestions for new policies. We felt like at this stage in the comprehensive plan, given that these wouldn't have a chance for more public vetting or vetting by other boards, that we should take our time next year to really review these and fine tune them and do our due diligence to make sure they're the policies that we want to advance. So that is the majority of them. And then there was one around strengthening a policy around energy use patterns. Again, we felt like that would, and I can pull up the specific policy, but that it might be best to wait for a more robust discussion on that and include as part of the ICAP update instead of trying to expedite that consideration for this version of the comprehensive plan. And I will just remind folks, if we make updates to the ICAP, those would then be reflected in an update to the comp plan following adoption of the ICAP. So they would eventually be moved in. And then just the last one, for consideration, we thought possibly could be punted to an ICAP update was specifically calling out CERT under the resilience and well-being section. CERT is one of our major response mechanisms for emergencies, but did feel like it was specific enough it might best belong in the ICAP. So those are the staff responses to that group of recommendations that we move those to the consideration of the ICAP update, but we're looking for feedback on whether you all are okay with that or if we want to pull any out for further discussion tonight for immediate consideration in the environment.
Based on what I hear tonight, I agree. I understand where you're going with the proposed new. We're a little late in the game for those to make it into the plan now. Although I still think what I'm hearing from the previous conversation, I think those should be mentioned in our letter so that it's known that those are out there and that we're thinking about them.
And we could just flag that they'll be considered as part of the ICAP update. Would that be acceptable?
Jenny?
I just had a question. So Stacy, you said that once we adopt it in ICAP, it's not like it's automatic, it goes to the next comp. That's basically the next time the comp plan comes around, it needs to be updated. Is that correct?
Yeah, and Stephen and I chat about that. I think as we've mentioned to the board, our goal is to update the ICAP by spring of 26 ahead of our next budget cycle. And then the comp plan would be updated by the end of 2026. Is that correct, Stephen? So there'd be a couple month lag time between that update.
Sorry, could you say the timing again?
The ICAP would be updated by spring 2026 is our goal. And then the comp plan goes through annual refreshers or minor updates. And so we could include some revisions into the comp plan by the end of 2026. Is that, Stephen, jump in if I'm mistaken?
Yep, no, that's correct. For the comprehensive plan, we basically have an annual review process for if there's updates to other functional plans. So like the ICAP going through its update and planning to get that done by early 2026. It'll essentially just get it rolled into the 2026 comp plan updates, which would probably be done by the end of the year.
Right, well, I support the direction on this. The only thing I would say is if there's anything that we feel like is sending us in the wrong direction before then, which I don't know all the detail of these, but that would be the one thing that we should talk about, but I don't know if that exists.
Sending in the wrong direction.
Oh, like if what the current comp plan says is sending us in the wrong direction relative to what we think the next update will be, that would be something that we should be talking about. And I didn't have time since this was sent out, so I'm not sure what's in this section, but that if there's anything that anyone feels like falls into that category, that is something I think we should talk about. Otherwise,
Yeah, so I think what we have proposed on the table is all the new proposed policies would remain in the letter. We will note for PPC that those will be considered as part of the next ICAP update, but we'll retain them in the letter just to make sure they're not lost. What's that? Okay. We lost Keith. Oh, no, we do still have Keith. I don't know why, Keith, you're not showing up on our screen. I'm gonna try and spotlight you. Keith, are you?
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, no, we got you. It's just our screen being weird tonight. Are you comfortable with that? If anything we're saying you're not following because it's a little complex, just let us know. But are you comfortable with that approach?
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that.
You're fine. It's our screen. Okay.
I just have one, I do think one thing we should think about in the overall format is just making sure that we have prioritized the things that we need to get across. Like this is more of an FYI. This is not something that PPC necessarily needs to know. So that would just like, I would appreciate knowing what is really critical to review and like is applicable to the current update. So that would be, I think, considered.
There's a couple that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, that was the new ones. And then the other ones we were gonna flag for the ICAP update was around policy F3. This is more aggressive in terms of requesting a more aggressive approach for shifting energy patterns. And then there was one on mention of CERT, the Community Emergency Response Team. So our proposal is those are considered as part of the ICAP update, but wanted to make sure the board was comfortable with that, or if we want to pull them out for further discussion tonight. And if it's helpful, I can pull up what policy F3 is, or David can.
Yeah,
read
so
it to us.
for context, policy F3 is one of the targets in the climate action plan related to reducing fossil fuel use in existing buildings by 20% by 2030 and 80% by 2050.
Is that consistent with what's in the comp plan?
So that's what's in the comp plan right now, is reducing fossil fuel use in existing buildings 20% by 2030. And that's consistent with the climate action plan as well. And that's again, the same existing buildings fossil fuel target from the King County Climate Collaborative as well, which is really where that came from in the first place.
There was a comment here to strengthen that policy to be more aggressive. Ever brought that forward?
Yeah, I can just give context. That was my comment. And that was, the reason I said that is there's another policy that is to reduce overall energy use by 25% in buildings. And so it's, to me, weird that we would have, if we hit the 25% reduction, we would have already achieved more than we've said in the fossil fuel reduction. So, and maybe there's some math I'm not doing right, but that seems to me like we should have a more aggressive, if we're trying to reduce by 25%, then the target for fossil fuel reduction should be higher than the target for overall energy use.
Our folks, can we punt that to the ICAP update for discussion on the target? Since I think we want the comp plan to reflect the ICAP targets as written.
I'm fine with that. Yeah. I just think that's something we need to update on the ICAP.
Yeah.
That just seems inconsistent to have it.
That might require, when we're doing the ICAP update process, we can probably try and do some analysis there. That 25% includes electricity use.
Yeah.
Right. So that's going to be why there's that difference in percentage numbers. Because that's talking about overall energy use, so electricity and fossil fuels, right, versus just the fossil fuels. Although, as we're thinking about these overall greenhouse gas reductions, that we're also going to electrify some of that fossil fuel use, and so there's kind of all of these pieces working together and to hit all these different goals. a good thing to look at.
Okay. Move on.
Comments on that?
And then just the last one was the mention of CERT, the Community Emergency Response Team as part of the resilience and well-being policies. Again, I think staff would be comfortable making that change. We did feel like that level of specificity in terms of calling out a program could be maybe best included in a functional plan like the ICAP, but defer to the board on your recommendation.
Is CERT mentioned in your emergency management planning documents as well?
Yes, yeah.
Only comment there. Go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to say that was my suggestion. Just seemed like there wasn't a lot of specificity in mentioning ways to have that readiness for climate resilience. And that's the program that I'm familiar with that would seem best positioned for that. But like you say, if it's already mentioned in emergency plans and stuff, maybe not necessary.
I don't know that CERT from the emergency management side takes into account climate resilience.
Something we're working with
Yeah.
Jared and emergency management office on. I don't know if they are called out specifically in the ICAP, but as we work more with them, and they really are kind of a frontline response team, it will be important that they are called out in the ICAP.
Mhm.
Any concerns if we hold that one for the ICAP update? Are you okay with that, Keith? Or is your preference to do them?
Yeah, if other folks agree, that makes sense to me.
I would say talk with your emergency management folks, because CERT is a very defined program. The two need to be in correlation with each other. If you're going to mention the word CERT in here, they have to be teaching that in that class.
All right, I think David's then going to talk about the other recommendations that we want to get some agreement on the board, whether or not to make those immediate revisions to the environment.
Yeah, so I'm going to go through each of these individually and provide just some context around some of the staff response, and then kind of open it up to thoughts from the board on inclusion in the letter. So for the first point around the vision, so that piece of the vision, that point relates to educating and engaging residents and businesses to inspire behavior change in addressing climate change and enhancing our natural environment. And the comment was to update the vision to specifically call out encompassing both adults and school-age children. And then also to essentially expand the incorporation of education throughout the comp plan and the environmental and climate stewardship element as well. So the staff response really is that we have incorporated education into many of the policies, although of course we're open to exploring other spots where that fits. Some of the specific recommendations on kind of the pieces to include around education, staff feel might fall more under school district purview versus, say, the city, right? Especially as it relates to impacting school curriculum. And then additionally, as we get into more specific actions, that can be something that we can talk about during the ICAP update process. So that's kind of some of our initial thought on this recommendation here, but I'd love to hear any board thoughts on this comment.
That was my comment. Basically, it's, sustainability is a difficult concept for people to understand. And I think it needs to start early. And somehow try to get it into curriculum. I don't know how we would do that, but education, when I read these plans, it sounds like education is everywhere within the plans, but it's kind of focused towards adults. And I think we just need to start early because that's my, that was my.
Yeah, I think it's a great, and we do have a partnership with a group that is sustainability ambassadors that presented in June that is actually working on some curriculum, but this may be a gap in this section where we're not calling out the high school and below age group. So we could look at that vision and see if there's any adjustments we could make to incorporate.
So Stacey, just one comment on that, and things may have changed, but I had actually requested like about 7 or 8 years back that, you know, the elementary schools should start doing environmental education. Start as a part of a separate class, or at least as a part of science class, or if you can't do it, at least start as an extracurricular class, but it should be a classwork. And I had gone to the principals and talked to a couple of school principals, and I was told that the school curriculum needs to be approved by the state. And so, you know, it was a long drawn procedure and it takes apparently 10 years to change the curriculum and stuff. So I just wanted to, and things may have changed, especially now, you know, everybody is getting more about climate action and other things. So I hope the change can be faster, but I just wanted to let you know that where it stood at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're trying to be careful that the city isn't getting in the way of OSPI or Issaquah School District. That is not our role, but where we can support programs like sustainability ambassadors or the students working on the ISD sustainability policy, which might bring in some requirements for sustainable curriculum. There is a role.
And it could be, you know, included as a part of all these sustainability programs, you know, green teams, sustainability ambassadors, everything done. So, but it needs to be consistent to the point of John. It needs to be consistent and actually an educational effort versus, you know, just once in a month type of extracurricular activity to really get the, you know, to be effective.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I think David and I can look at the language tomorrow and look where we can incorporate concepts around this to the vision.
Yeah, I think the vision and then also maybe some of that introduction language as well, where we might have a little bit more space to extrapolate on some pieces, right? Okay. Great. Moving right along, streams, wetlands, and wildlife. So this is goal area B and C. And the comment from the board was to incorporate more of the comments specifically related to wildlife and some of those policies that were proposed back in January, emphasizing the importance of wildlife protection and adopting policies that support neighborhood level education around wildlife. So I think as staff are kind of thinking about this and exploring this, some of the questions that came up really is where does this really fall within the city? Right now, a lot of the wildlife work is spread out across different departments. Some of this is wildlife work that I don't believe that the city is really doing yet. And so I think there is some question on kind of where does this really land in this, in the comp plan, and then also kind of integrated into city work. Yeah, so I'll leave it there, but I'd love to hear kind of board reactions to really what we should continue to include in this letter.
As the person that keeps pushing this one, if you look at next door, you look at any of the neighborhood Facebook groups, look at anything else, the thing you most likely see is there's a bear in my neighborhood. Or did you see the, you know, whatever it is that's walking down the street these days? The people in this community have a unique coexistence with wildlife. It's a really important part of the community. That's why we all live here. They're not just in streams and wetlands. And I think we need to acknowledge that boy, I really like living in an area where we have big cats, little cats, bears. There's not many places you can say that you've got that walking down your street. And so my comment to this is we should acknowledge that because it is such a big part of this community. Now, maybe it does, because it's with streams, wetlands, and wildlife. Well, you think streams and wetlands, but wildlife is walking down the street. It's walking through the trees. We see it all over the place when you're hiking. So what I'm trying to do is acknowledge that part of this community that makes Issaquah so special. And that's part of our comprehensive plan. We want to keep seeing those darn wildlife walking down our street. And I'm kind of passionate about it because I just think, I really love seeing those posts that people put. And I think we should continue to celebrate that that's what we've managed to accomplish in this community. That's just my vision of this.
Jim? So the part of this that comes to mind for me, which I've been a bit of a broken record on, is, and it's just an example, is our trash management and the education around trash management and bears. And so I feel like there is opportunity, and like, I'm not sure what all specifics of Nancy's comments are, but I do think that the coexisting with wildlife is something that our residents aren't aware, that the fact that because they're not protecting their trash, a mama bear and 3 cubs had to be put down. Like, that's the unfortunate truth of what these people putting out their trash and leaving it out is. And so I don't think that's probably the way that you say it to them, but I do think that there's an education gap of like, what do you need to do to be a responsible citizen around that wildlife? Because actually, I don't want to see that mama bear out on Thursdays around trash. Like, so that, like, I think there's like, that's actually a negative in some cases. So I do think that there's opportunity, and that's something that is critical. And I don't know where it lives, but it is like, we still don't have it within our waste management, like contract or anything. Like, it still is a gap. And I think it's how we're protecting wildlife throughout the city. And this seems like to Nancy's point, this is the only point that wildlife, or the only part of the comp plan that says wildlife. So I do think there's something there. I don't know what the specifics are, but that it's a core value, should be a core value of being in Issaquah, that we're educating ourselves to be responsible citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jamie. Thinking it from a comp plan perspective, I don't know if the comp plan can do anything to create an education program, but it certainly can promote it. So just having language in there stating that you want to promote wildlife education program, and kind of that last sentence you have in the middle box there, and getting that into the comp plan, that builds support for future staff to develop that program.
Maybe David, on the policies around wildlife, could you just quickly summarize
What they are?
Yeah, because I think
Yes.
they're more focused on corridors, connectivity, less on education.
Yeah, so the goal is to protect and improve the environment functions of conservation areas and corridors, to balance development with the natural environment, so people can coexist with fish and wildlife habitats. The policies themselves, so kind of digging in that one step further. The first one is to create connected wildlife corridors. The second is to coordinate land use planning and management related to fish and wildlife resources. The third is to improve fish habitat and remove barriers from natural systems. And the fourth is to integrate park system plans, goals, and policies into riparian corridors for multiple benefits, including enhanced wildlife habitat. So it is very focused on that habitat
Can you look
enhancement.
at that language again and see if you can incorporate education into some of that?
That's why I'm wondering, it doesn't quite fit within the goal, but I don't know where else it would best live, but we could bring in this language and add it in as a policy under that section. Stephen, would there be any major concerns with that?
Just reading through the language again.
add in the emphasize importance of wildlife protection, education, aiming for wildlife to thrive even as the city grows denser, and it's in the section.
Policy C or
Yeah.
goal C and B.
Which this does mention as the city grows denser, which fits into kind of what that goal is getting at also.
I have no concerns with the addition of the policy or the language into the element. It's just more of the question of what does that mean for the city? Is there specific actions or metrics that are tied to the policy? I think we would want to have that discussion with the next NICAP update.
Well, I know at one time we have talked in this board about where does the environment sit within the city, who's responsible for managing the environment, who's the environmental lead, and according to Stacy, I understand it's a team approach. And things like this lead us to more, do we need an environmental advocate leader in the city? And that conversation we haven't had here, but it's something that that person would take on in this role. So, you know, if that's important, so I'll point that out. We've had that conversation, haven't resolved it.
Great, well, we can make an update to that section. That is this concept. I know it is a new policy where we talked about policies being punted to the ICAP, but I think this concept has been brought up multiple times and discussed. So we can work on integrating it into the section.
So the next comment still relates to this wildlife goal C that I had mentioned before, relating to protecting and improving environmental functions for wildlife and people coexisting. And the comment was to include considerations for minimizing traffic, noise, and light pollution impacts on wildlife in policies regarding connected wildlife corridors. And one of the things that staff wanted to point out is that the way goal C is written and some of those policies are written to be broad, to encompass those pieces such as minimizing traffic, noise, and light pollution. And so those specific strategies aren't reflected into the policies themselves. But that can be something that we open up for discussion if that's something that the board would like to see reflected more. And more of that specific strategy pieces, or whether that's something more for functional plan updates.
Keith had a comment.
I just want to say this was my suggestion, and I'm noticing a trend where I look for input to provide and find it, you know, in real specific kind of ideas. So still learning what this board really needs from me in terms of that input. So please feel free to disregard that if it would be more appropriate just to leave it at those broader goals.
It's really important input because it might be lost, even if it doesn't get added into the comp plan. I think it's important that you flagged it so it's not lost as those plans are.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we want to, I mean, we thought it was worth a conversation with the board on whether they want to see that level of details.
Okay.
Any thoughts, any concerns if this level of detail is held off for other plans? Just want to see more in the
comment. Moving along to a comment relating to goal D, which is our tree goal area. So right now it reads maintain and enhance citywide tree canopy. And the comment is to revise the goal to read maintain and restore citywide tree canopy. And we wanted to bring this back to the board. This was actually a change made by the board at an earlier conversation, thinking that enhance goes beyond restoration and kind of is speaking more to really improving our tree canopy overall. And so I wanted to bring it back to the board on whether or not the board is still comfortable with that enhanced language, or whether or not we should go back to the language of restore instead.
I think that was my comment. It's my first read through.
Yeah.
That's why I picked it up. It just seemed like it was, you weren't hitting the mark by just enhancing text.
Okay.
My read of it.
I remember that earlier conversation. I think we talked about the difference between restore and enhance, and there was a lot of conversation about what does restore really mean? Restore to what level, when? So enhance was, I think where we landed on.
We wanted to bring it back if there's.
Yes, no, or-
No, it's okay. Just want to make sure folks are good with that.
no.
I do want to recognize the board has been going through this comp plan for over a year now, I believe. So there has been a lot of conversation, year and a half, a lot of conversations, and happy to keep bringing these questions up, and they're important to continue to keep addressing. So my understanding is that we're okay keeping enhanced language there? Yes. Okay. So the next question was related to policy D2, which reads, retain existing trees in critical areas and their buffers along designated walking and biking corridors and other green spaces. And the recommendation was to expand that policy to include retain and increase tree canopy along these corridors. I actually just chatted with Dan as he was leaving right now. Staff don't, I think, have any issues adding that increased language if that's something that the board would like to do. Roughly, there have been some conversations around increasing that tree canopy along some of those riparian corridors and other corridors isn't always necessarily doesn't always necessarily enhance the ecosystem services. However, it is something that we absolutely do want to do in some areas, maybe not in others, but it can definitely be part of this policy if the board would like to see that.
Jamie?
Yeah, that was my comment. I mean, I do think, especially after we just had the urban forest management plan, I think it is important that, yeah, it's not everywhere. Like, we aren't planting trees where they're not meant to be, but it seems aligned with what we're talking about for the urban forest management plan, to not just be talking about retaining trees, that there are opportunities to increase. So that was why I made the comment. So yeah, I would support it. Obviously, I support it.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's consistent with the comment above, maintain and enhance. And it's also consistent with the tree canopy goals of the city.
Okay. I think that is something that we can easily do. Any other questions or concerns on that one before I move on? Okay. So next we have, we're moving into our greenhouse gas policies now. So policy E8. So this is actually a new policy this year. That was proposed earlier in the process, but it's leveraging regional partnerships and advocate for statewide policies to address upstream and downstream greenhouse gas emissions from activities not directly controlled by Issaquah community members or the city of Issaquah, such as material consumption and aviation. And the comment was to focus on or have this policy address all forms of transportation, including those through and above the community, and not just to focus on aviation. When we were writing this policy for the first time this year, one of the ideas here was to kind of call out two of the big ideas or big areas where, frankly, the city doesn't have a lot of control over reducing emissions, but where we can do our best to advocate for and explore opportunities to support statewide policies that can address some of these emission areas. And so material consumption and aviation were called out as examples, but we're not meant to be an exhaustive list of these areas outside of or where we have less control. So I would turn it over to the board to see if there's any other comments on, are we comfortable with the level of detail that's in the policy, or do we, would the board like to see more specific examples, more transportation examples included in that?
Or we could remove the examples.
Or yes, we could do that.
I
Mhm.
Struck a nerve that felt like you were singling out aviation. And I see just as much greenhouse gases being emitted right on I-90 and State Route 900. People pass through. That was my thought.
Mhm.
Is all you have to know.
Jamie, I'm rereading this policy and I don't know what it means. That like it's that just something I don't actually. It's like a mental pretzel that I get into when I try to read this policy. So that I don't know. Could you state what this what are we trying to say with this policy?
Yeah, so this policy is intended to give us a little bit more flexibility, advocating for more policies at the state level that can address sources of greenhouse gas emissions that the city doesn't control and can't really pass policies to impact, right? So when we think about our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, some of those, the way those are calculated, there's different options, and some of that is, right, thinking about material consumption from community members. Some of those greenhouse gas inventories include aviation emissions, right? Transportation emissions on I-90 are included in our greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so this policy is intended to say kind of, well, what can we do to address those emissions that the city doesn't quite control, but instead, how can we kind of continue to push the state to go farther?
I do think that, and I actually think that more specific examples would be helpful because I don't think the average person, I don't think the average person is going to understand what the goal of this is. Like, so I think I don't know which examples those are, but it seems like examples would be helpful and maybe more specific examples because I think otherwise this one is going to be lost.
Is that the role of the city to, it seems like it should be, these kind of things should be dealt with at, say, the state or federal.
It should be, but we can sign on to letters, advocating for policy. So that would be our role.
Are you trying to set policies for the city itself?
No, that would be statewide
Okay.
or for a particular industry. Yeah. But we could, if generalizing it means it's not understood, we could look at more examples of what those sources are, so it doesn't look like we're calling out aviation specifically.
We could also potentially maybe pull out some of the more technical words. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's pulling out some of that piece to make it a little streamlined. Yeah, Raj.
So Jamie, I'm a little confused, and this may be because I haven't read it in detail as well, but so what is the goal of the policy? Is it, because first when I was listening to you, I thought it was more for, and I totally get it, means, even though the GHG emissions cutting down goals are pretty ambitious as it's for the city. And it is way more complicated, actually, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of things which, especially being a city, are out of your control. Because, you don't have the control over what everybody else does or passes through Issaquah. But at the same time, as a city, those emissions will contribute to your calculation, correct? That is where the problem is. So first, I thought you were trying to give the city a little bit of flexibility. So basically, you were trying to spell it out that there are a few emissions which are out of control, and these are some examples which will be still contributed to the city, just as an FYI. So the ambitious goal may or may not include, the reduction in these emissions. Is that the goal of this policy, or is it actually to spell it out as an FYI for the state that, hey, this is what is happening, and so we need the flexibility, but you guys need to do something about it. So that is where I am kind of lost. I'm not sure.
Sure, yeah, maybe flexibility was not the right word for me to use. I think simply put, the policy is intended to encourage the city to advocate at the state level for some of these, to address greenhouse gas emissions that should be impacted at the state level versus at the city level.
So then I have another additional question. So is there a discussion in your greenhouse gas emissions inventory and reduction programs where you actually spell out what are the factors which are not controlled by the city and how they add up to your greenhouse gas emissions? I think that would be a good thing to add because, you know, that is going to add to your GHG emissions no matter what, and you may not have enough control over it.
Some of them are included into our greenhouse gas inventory, some are not. So for instance, aviation is not included in our current community-wide numbers, although we do have some of those numbers based on estimates of population and income level that's kind of disaggregated down to city levels, right? So there, some of those numbers we have, some we don't have, and I think to some degree as greenhouse gas inventory processes change, there is going to be kind of updates and kind of what is included into those greenhouse gas inventories. And so some of these aspects in particular are kind of on that next edge of whether or not they're included into greenhouse gas inventories in the future as we're thinking about a more comprehensive look at really where do our greenhouse gas emissions come from.
And so just one thing I would like to add. So it is good to have these assumptions or the discussions clearly stated somewhere. And I'm myself doing GHG inventory for the company. So I can tell you very frankly, as you said, you know, the processes change and the criteria change. So I actually note down the assumptions or whatever is there, what data is available or what is not available. I have clear listings of all of it because, you know, I assume over the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a lot of back and forth on it. Yeah. That will be it. Thank you.
Was it the intent of this policy to talk only about things outside of city's domain, or is it also cities, decisions the city may make which would affect expenditure of greenhouse gas in the broader world? So for example, policies about sending people to conferences in an airplane versus attending virtually. Or, I mean, even this wonderful facility here is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions here on a more local basis. So is that part of the intent, or is that covered somewhere else?
So I would say those are covered other points in the comp plan and the climate action plan around specifically our reducing, say, energy use from our buildings, right? And from our city operations, things like that. This policy is really focused on the things outside of our control, directly outside of our control.
Like an example being like, is it building code a good example of this? Like trying to advocate for, I think that's what it's like.
Yeah, I don't think so. We have others around the building code. I think this is like operations at King County's at the dump, essentially, where we get accounted for that, even though it's not within the city. It's for community members within Issaquah that are flying. We can account for those emissions. I don't know what other good examples.
Yeah, another good example is like, you know, for instance, if our community members are buying a lot of tables and the table, you know, the manufacturing of those tables are causing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Mm-hmm. We as the city can't really pass any policies, or we can't really pass too many policies that are addressing the greenhouse gas emissions and the manufacturing of a table from somewhere else. But this policy within our comp plan is to say, well, where possible, let's work with the state or advocate at the state level to kind of put into place those policies that could address kind of that material consumption that is just not really accounted for in most of our greenhouse gas inventories.
Well, why don't we can try and rework it?
It sounds like this one needs a little.
Yeah, well, at least for this version of the comp plan, we'll either simplify it so it's easier to understand or add some more or add some more examples, so folks have a better understanding. And then I think as we get into the ICAP kind of finessing.
I would suggest to
specific policies.
generalize it a little bit and
Yeah.
just speak to being advocates, lobbyists with the legislature to promote the reduction in GHG emissions. All forms of transportation, material consumption, et cetera.
Okay. Excellent.
The last one then is kind of a general comment.
Yeah. So the last one is there's a section at the end of the environmental and community stewardship element related to results and accountability. And the comment was to incorporate this throughout the comp plan. And Stephen actually might have a better response to this than I do, but my understanding is that for the most part, these are kind of standard policies that are incorporated into all of the subsections of the comprehensive plan. And there are also specific metrics for results and accountability are recognized in each of the functional plans themselves. Stephen, do you have anything to add on the results and accountability policy?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, it's the intent with creating that section for all the elements was to recognize that all the functional plans already have identified metrics aligned with all these policies. And we want to make sure that flexibility on if we want to change those metrics, stay with the functional plans. Because once you have it built into the comprehensive plan, you have to go through the comprehensive plan process to make those changes, which is a timely process to do that, which the functional plans, you can do that at pretty much any time, whenever you have these functional plan discussions on making updates.
Well, this was my comment, and my take on it is I was reading through all these plans, and all of a sudden, the only place I really saw this results and accountability was in the environmental section. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. And that's why I brought up the comment. That may be an overall section added to the whole comp plan, which is you need to, build the programs to make this, to assess the results and make some accountability, but it really didn't fit in just this section. So that's how I came up with that.
I think we had this because the comment was within the environment element. We had it in that section, but I'll include it as a general comment in the letter.
Yeah, I think it's a general comment more. That should be a section maybe in the comp plan for all sections to follow, not just for the environmental element.
We're already over time for tonight's meeting, so close the comments on that unless anybody has pretty strong feelings.
I can just talk about next steps. So David and I are going to take all the feedback on the environment element and make the changes as was discussed tonight into the element, and then any of those that are not addressed or we've decided to punt towards ICAP update, we'll make sure those are captured in the letter still and reflected there. And then we'll be making a couple revisions to the letter that will go to PPC. Don, we can talk after the meeting, but get that to you tomorrow morning. If folks, we did send out the link to the letter last night, and it was added to the meeting packet. If there are any other comments, concerns that we didn't address tonight, or that you felt like your comments weren't reflected, please let us know tomorrow morning if possible. But we really did try to just take all that feedback and incorporate it directly into that letter. So
Your intent is to send that letter by end of day tomorrow.
yeah, that will go to Stephen to include in the PPC packet. And then just before we close out, I have 3 quick things I wanted to do in the rest of the day. But we can close this session unless there's any other questions, feedback. Thank you, Stephen, for being here.
Hey, Stephen.
Thank you all.
Three quick items before we close out. I wanted to see if any youth report. I know Mina's not here. If there's anything you wanted to share.
I just wanted to ask, does the environmental board ever do anything for the Salmon Days event?
We haven't.
So just considering that it's like a fair and by nature it's gonna be quite, it's gonna be a lot of littering and such, it may be an idea to consider doing something like that.
Yeah, we could send out volunteer opportunities. The city is doing a booth this year that all the departments share. We are not sponsoring any booths. We did last year, but we are not doing that this year. But we can send out opportunities for the world to get involved. I know the hatchery has volunteer opportunities, I think, through the chamber too. So I think it'd be wonderful to be the board out there or even out talking with members of the community. People wanted to, now that you have your nice name tags. So yeah, definitely, maybe that's something.
That's why she did that.
So that's a great, maybe we could have a little conversation about that in September ahead of Salmon Days. Good discussion.
If you have specific ideas for that,
Yeah.
we'd love to hear.
And nothing in particular, it's just kind of something that's floating around in my mind.
Yeah. Great, and then what I do have a number of updates, and David and I wanted to seek some volunteers for something, and I have some reminders. I will send those all in an email because I don't want to keep you all here. The last two things I wanted to mention quickly are thank you. You all are reviewing 3 massive plans over the last 6 weeks. The park plan, comp plan, and the urban forest management plan. Those are one brand new plan and 2 major updates. So just wanted to say thank you. I know it's a huge amount of time, especially during summer. So really, really appreciate all that input. Last thing I wanted to say is thank you to Nick. Nick is wrapping up actually next week. He's done a ton of work over the last few months on climate vulnerability assessment, resilience hub, led a climate challenge, team leader training with members of the community and help coordinate volunteers and 10 more. So just a huge thank you to Nick. Nick will be traveling for a bit and then maybe looking into some park interpretation. And yeah, so really appreciate everything that Nick's done for the city, and please share your appreciation on your way out the door.
That's it?
Yeah.
All right, with that, thank you. I'll be to an end.
Mhm.